Well, this unit kind of flows nicely from our previous unit. We talked about storage with Windows Server 2012. Once we have all this storage, we're going to want to put files on it, and we're going to want to share those files and work with those files and understand the file system. So in this unit, we're going to talk about file systems. We're going to talk about sharing files and so forth. And we'll also, towards the end, talk about printing. Printing is kind of an interesting topic in the sense that I think it's kind of one of those forgotten topics with Windows Server 2012. A lot of folks don't use the print services in Windows. We're always worried about all these other things we can do. Really, there's no good reason that it's covered in this unit in your textbook, probably other than the fact that it really doesn't have any other home. So it's covered here under File and Print Services. It really wouldn't stand on its own in its own unit, and of course neither would file sharing either. They kind of both are relatively short topics. So our objectives are to describe how Windows implements file and print sharing, secure access to files with permissions, creating file shares, and describe work folders, as well as Windows printing, configure and manage Windows printing. So let's get started. So as an overview, file and print sharing functions are in the File and Storage Services role. The Windows clients access shared files and printers. By default in Windows, we're going to use the Server Message Block Protocol, or SMB. You may be familiar with this when you put into when you put \\something, that's SMB that you're using. Some people call that a UNC path, which is used by SMB. So it's a client-server application layer protocol that provides network sharing, network and printer sharing really, as well as authentication. So a common variation of SMB is Common Internet File System, or CIFS. Windows Server 2012 also supports NFS, which was typically a Linux-based or Unix-based file sharing system. So it's nice that we can now operate with the, so if you're on a Linux file system, if you want to share files from Linux to Windows, being able to support a common protocol is important. Now, in Linux, there is a service called Samba that you can install that approximates what SMB does, but it's nice that Windows now natively supports NFS as well, so we can go the other way. So it is a nice feature to have. So Server for NFS is a role service found under File and Storage Services, so it's one of the role services that you can enable. So it needs to be installed in order to support clients that are using NFS. Windows shares printers using SMB, but also supports other protocols such as LPR or LPD or line printing. So that's another option. So let's talk about securing access to files with permissions. So there are two ways to secure files. We can use share permissions and NTFS permissions, which are distinct from one another. Permissions basically specify which users can access a file system object and what users can do with that object. So share permissions apply when using a network to access shared files, and NTFS permissions apply when you're on the local file system. So share permissions are when we're accessing a file, for example, with SMB over the network or Windows file sharing, whereas the NTFS permissions apply when we're looking at files locally, if we're locally moving files or trying to access files within the local file system. So there are three types of objects that can be assigned permissions in a file system: users, groups, and computers. So an object security settings have three components that make up its security descriptor: discretionary access control lists, or DACL, object owner, system access control list. So let's talk about discretionary access control lists first. So it's a list of security principles where each has permissions that define access to an object. An ACE is an access control entry. It's an entry in a discretionary access control list. And the object owner is usually the user account that created the object, or a group or a user who has been assigned ownership of that object. A system access control list is a file system component that defines the settings for auditing access to an object. So in other words, when you create a file in Windows with NTFS, you are the owner of that file. We call that a discretionary access control mechanism because as the owner of that file, you decide what the permissions will be on that file when you create that file. By default, files will have a certain level of permission. That can also be changed, and that can also be inherited. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But basically, discretionary, where that term comes from, is we're talking about the user having discretion over who's going to access this file. Some file access mechanisms are non-discretionary. So in other words, somebody makes the decision for you as to what they can do or what even you can do. So you might be able to create a file, but you may not be able to do anything with that file if you create it. Or maybe you can't even create that file. You have to be simply given access to files that are already created. So there are other mechanisms out there, but in Microsoft Windows, NTFS, for the file system, it's generally discretionary access control. And you have a discretionary access control list, which is a list of the security principles and the permissions that you can define to that object. We're going to talk about what those security principles are. This would be things like read, write, full control, and you've probably seen these before in the file permissions in Windows. An access control entry is an entry in the discretionary access control list. So that's where it actually says this is what a certain type of user can do. The owner is either the person that created the file or someone who's been given ownership of that file. So you can be given ownership of a file, or by default, when you create a file, you are the owner of that file. You can also have your ownership rescinded from a file. You know, the administrator could transfer that file's ownership to someone else and you no longer have ownership of that file. That could happen as well. And a system access control list is basically how we audit. So that's the mechanisms that we use for auditing access to those files. So users can be assigned permissions to an object in 4 ways. They can create the object, in which case it automatically has their permissions as an owner of that object. The user's account can be added to the object's DACL. In other words, we can add a user and give them permission to a file. And that's called explicit permission. So we explicitly give permission to a user or to a group by assigning them to that file and then selecting which options that user has. Perhaps I create a file and I want to give someone else read-only access to that file to do something with it. That would be the second option here, where I would go in, select the other user account, and give them read-only access, for example, to my file. And by the way, those would be those DACL objects that I was talking about earlier, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. The group that a user belongs to could be added, right? So, and that's also a type of explicit permission. So in other words, if I want to give access to my file to read my file to everyone in a certain group, I could do that. And that would be explicitly giving access. The last option is through inheritance. So basically, by default in Windows Server and NTFS, when you create a file or create a folder and you create another folder within that folder, it will inherit all of the permissions from its parent, the folder in which it's contained. So the default permissions of an object when it's created are those of its parent. So there is this concept of inheritance. So in many cases, you might give somebody access, read-only access, for example, to a folder. And when you create a file inside that folder, by default, they will also have read-only access to that file within that folder. So you can inherit permissions. So that's the third option. So the first one is that you created the object. The second two are explicitly giving somebody or a group permission. And the last one is you inherit those permissions, which may be non-obvious that those permissions are assigned to you or that they've been assigned to a file or an object. So share permissions can apply to folders and files accessed across the network. So what I just described are NTFS permissions, but then there are also share permissions, which is how we define what someone's allowed to do with the file when they're accessing it over the network, which is separate and distinct from NTFS. It can be configured on individual files as well as folders, and there are 3 share permissions. You can do read, change, and full control. So read, change, and full control are the 3 share permissions. If you don't have any of those 3, then they can't see it or they can't read it or do anything with that file. So it's not as granular as NTFS permissions. Generally, the default share permission is read for everyone. So when you turn on file sharing for a file, it'll allow everyone to read it and no one to change it except for you on the local file system. And then you would be able to change that, obviously, to give more permissions to users on the network, say to add files, change files, and so forth. So NTFS permissions can be configured on folders and files. Folders have 6 permissions and 14 special permissions, while files have 5 permissions and 13 special permissions. So the standard permissions that you'll see in NTFS, you'll see this when you right-click on a file or a folder and you go to Properties, and then you click on, in Properties, there's a little thing that shows you the permissions for that file. The standard ones are read, read and execute, list folder contents, write, modify, and full control. But there are others as well, and this is from your textbook, but this shows you some of the other options that you'll see other than the basic ones. So there are the 6 basic permissions, and then you have the 13 special permissions, which are also included here. Here, these are some of the special permissions. So as far as ownership goes, every file system object, files and folders, must have an owner. And an object owner is granted certain implicit permissions. Implicit meaning that it's understood, right? It's not explicitly defined, but it's an understood level of permission. So a user can become the owner of a file system object in 3 ways. They can create the file or folder. So if you create it, you are the owner. You can take ownership of a file or folder, or you can be assigned ownership of a file or folder. And by the way, you have to have permission to take ownership. Not everyone can do that. Inheritance gets a little tricky. So by default, initial permissions are set to at the root of a volume. All folders and files within the volume inherit those settings unless configured otherwise. So subfolders and files are configured to inherit permissions by default. And permission inheritance can be disabled if you need to. So there's a little button you can click when you right-click and go to Properties and you go into the Advanced File permissions. You can hit a little button that disables inheritance. That way you're not fighting with inheritance when you're trying to restrict access to a file or a folder. And you can see it here on the bottom left-hand side. That's where the disabled inheritance button is. So effective access is sometimes, because of inheritance, it can be sometimes confusing to figure out what permissions exactly a user has to a file or a folder because of that inheritance. So Windows 2012 does give us a nice tool to figure that out. So under the Advanced Security Settings dialog box, there's an Effective Access tab where you can select a user or a group and you can see the access to a file or folder. So this will show you effectively what access a certain user or group has that may not be as obvious because of the inheritance of those permissions. So you can get kind of, this is the, this effective access is really the last resort. This is, okay, this is exactly what we know this user can do with this file, either because it's been explicitly defined within the permissions for that object itself, or it's been inherited from a parent object. So now that we know about, how, well, with both NTFS and with file sharing, how we can apply these permissions and how that works a little bit, now we have to figure out what's going to happen if we copy or move files and folders. What's going to happen to those permissions. So if you have a file or folder that's copied, and the important term here is copied. So this slide's a little confusing if you don't pay attention to copying and moving. We're going to talk about both. So if you copy a file from any location in an NTFS volume to any location either in the same or a different NTFS volume. So from one NTFS, anywhere else in NTFS where there's the same or another volume, it's going to inherit the permissions from the destination folder. So when you copy, it takes on the permissions from the destination where you copied it to. So it's going to inherit permissions from wherever you copied it. On the other hand, if you move a file within the same NTFS permission, NTFS volume, it's going to retain its original permissions. So again, when you copy, it inherits. When you move to the same volume, it's going to retain its original permissions. But if you move it to a different NTFS volume, it will inherit the destination folder permissions. So a little bit confusing. So if you copy it, no matter what, when you copy, it's going to inherit. But when you move within the same volume, it keeps its original permission. But if you move it to a different NTFS volume, then it's going to inherit the destination folder permissions. Now, if you move a file from a FAT32 or FAT volume to an NTFS volume, it's going to inherit the destination permission on the FAT volume, or on the NTFS. Remember, FAT and FAT32, that doesn't have permissions, right? That feature didn't exist in FAT32. So instead, since it has no permissions, it's basically going to inherit wherever it lands in NTFS. So that's kind of an easy one to remember. And finally, a file or folder that is moved or copied from an NTFS volume to a FAT volume loses everything. So what this means to you is that if you move a file or copy a file to a FAT32 partition, then you delete it in NTFS and later on move it back, the file permissions are instead going to be inherited. So any changes you made to the permissions in that file since you moved it are going to be lost when you move it back from FAT32 because there are no file permissions in FAT32 or FAT. They simply didn't exist back then. So those are the 5 things you have to keep in mind when you're moving and copying files. And I'm spending some time stressing this because a lot of times as a system administrator in a Windows environment, a lot of your time is spent trying to figure out how permissions were assigned or how permissions are being effectively applied to files and folders. Someone will say, hey, I'm trying to access this file on the network and I can't get to it. Why am I not able to read it? I should be able to read it. You'll be able to tell that, hey, this person's supposed to be able to get to this file. Why can't they access it? Or even worse, you find out that people are able to access files and they're not supposed to be able to access it. And that's an even bigger concern, right? So that happens as well. So you want to make sure you understand how these permissions are applied to files. And we did talk about ownership and inheritance and some of the different ways that you can explicitly define permissions for files. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about Windows file sharing in a little bit more detail. So we concentrated on NTFS in this deck, and in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk more about Windows file sharing.